Hi everyone, this is the video for getting started, and this video actually, I like the floating cobweb behind my canvas. This video is actually about kind of preparing your canvas and doing some practice stuff more than actually starting the very first painting. So the first thing I do that you saw me do just there is put some linseed oil on a rag and I wipe it into the surface of my canvas. And then after I've done that, then I get a little bit of paint. And when I'm doing a monochromatic painting for the beginning class, I use black paint. I don't use any of the graves, the gray tones, and that's on purpose because white is an opaque color. And I don't want any opacity in my underpainting part. So basically what I did there is I wiped some black paint, put a little bit more oil on my rag so that I could spread it a little bit more easily. You don't want this drippy in any way, shape, or form. You just want enough that you're staining the canvas background so you're not working on a white background. And like I said, I don't use a tint or anything that has white in it for doing this because I don't want that opacity added back into things. It'll ruin your shadows as you keep painting. So it's good to stay out of whites being involved in your underpainting. After I've done that, I prime my brushes. Anytime I'm going to use a brush other than my blending brushes, okay, the blending brushes you don't do this with, I dip it into my linseed oil and then wipe off any excess oil before I start painting. And then at that point I'm ready to start. And so generally what I do for a monochromatic painting is I dip that oiled brush into a little bit of my black paint and I use that to sketch in what it is I'm going to be doing for my practice. And the practice painting and the little value study that you're going to see me do in this demo, I don't worry about drawing these ahead of time. I just kind of start blocking things in. And I want to keep it very small because the first thing that I'm going to work on here is a little bit of a value study. And that's just getting an idea of what values are going to go in what places, making sure I'm happy with the composition that I've chosen for my painting and all that good stuff. So what you see right now is just very simply I'm looking for the relationship of different objects to the next objects and trying to get, and I'll come back and keep refining and making improvements as I go. But that's basically where I start off with. After I've got some of that blocked in, let me move forward just a little bit. I also note some of the drapery areas and kind of start making the final like boundaries and so on. This is the size, this is what my actual painting is going to end up being that I work on alongside you guys. So you can see as I put this final little porcelain piece that's down here at the bottom in my still life, I realize that I've made my paint canvas a little too narrow for the size canvas I'm going to use, and so I corrected that outside edge. The next thing I do is I've taken a little bit of that thinned out black paint and I'm just blocking in some of my shadow areas. I always block out and like to pay attention to what is in shadow and what is in light. And typically the way that we do that is to block out our shadow areas. We call it massing when we lock in those shadow areas. Because of my viewpoint, I don't have a lot of shadow areas in this still life. They're more like spaced out. They're not grouped together in large masses like they might be sometimes. So that's okay though. That works out well for what I'm doing. And so I just keep blocking those in. I'm going to move this down and out of the way a little bit. And then after I've started doing that, then the next step is I'm going to start picking up some of my values. And so let me explain a couple things with this before I go into the painting. Let me pull up this image right here. This is a photo I took separately after I was all done of the part that's going to be my painting. And I did this more for being able to discuss things with you. So a couple things you want to really pay attention to is how to use your 10th step grayscale. And how to attribute different areas within this. If you remember, and what would really help is while I'm discussing this is to maybe have your values that you've mixed, your palette that you've mixed out, so you can kind of look at it along with me as I discuss how I would use this. But if you remember, a 1 is white and a 10 is black. So 9 and 8 are pretty dark grays, 7 through like 5 are more like middle grays, 4 through 2 are light grays, with 2 being very, very light gray, and then a 1 is white. And what you want to do is you want to make sure that as you're deciding your value range on different areas, that you don't overlap your shadow and your light values. So normally I draw up on the board as I'm discussing this, and I haven't really figured out how to do this better, but what you want to pay is can. Let's say that the light area of the can, let's say the lightest area is about a 7. Okay, and that main light mass goes to like a 7 to maybe a 6.5 or so, 6.5 to like a 7.5. That would be the range of my light area. And then as I look at my shadow area, I might say that's like an 8 to a 9 or 10 even, because I do have some really dark, almost black areas. So my overall range for this can is, let's say, a 10 to an 8 for the shadow, and then a 7 to a 6.5, 7.5 to 6.5 for the light side. Okay, so notice that those two areas I just talked about, if we were to write them down, do not overlap. But then if I were to look at my drapery back here, let's say that the light part of my drapery comes all the way up to like a 2 in some of these really bright areas, and it goes down to maybe an 8 at the very darkest. It's not anywhere near as dark as this can is typically. So let's say it's about an 8 for the very darkest. Let's say the light side of it, which would be the light through the halftone areas, places like this or like this, would be a 2 to maybe a 4 at the darkest. And let's say the shadow side of it is like a 4.5 or so, or a 5, up to like an 8. So notice again that our two areas, the shadow and the light areas, don't overlap each other. We keep them separate. So about a 2 to a 4.5 or so for the light side, and about a 4.5 or 5 up to an 8 for the shadow side. That's different from this can area where the light part of this is going all the way to, I think we said, a 7.5. A 7.5 to like a 6.5 is, I think, what we said on there. So notice that our light side on this can is about the same value. It starts out at least in the shadow values of our drapery, but that's because our overall values of the can versus the drapery are so different. The drapery is basically white, okay, and the can is basically a really dark brown rusted can that I found somewhere. So they start out with different values in their light side, and then the shadow sides are ending up a little bit darker as well. So that's important to kind of keep in mind as we work on this painting right here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out where do I want to see the light sides of my can, and where do I want to see the shadow sides versus where do I want to see the light sides and shadow sides of my drapery. As I keep working on it, what you'll notice is how I differentiate some of these values. So I've come in some of these areas that are more halftone areas and shadow areas in the drapery, and I've hit them in slightly different values than the light side of my can or the shadow side of my can. As we keep going through to kind of save some of this. And it's hard to tell from this image right here what I can see, but again, we could pull up that photograph and have it a little bit over here to the side. And now you can kind of see a little bit better why I'm picking some of the values that I'm picking for areas within this painting that you guys are watching. In fact, let's move this a little bit more like that. And that might make a little bit more sense. So as I bring the same drapery behind the bottle, notice that what it does is it gets a little darker. This might have been this value or this value outside if the bottle wasn't here, but because the bottle is here, it gets darker. So right here, maybe it's a 2 or a 3. Over here, it's more like a 4 or a 5. Okay, and that's basically how we work with transparency, is by painting the things that are outside of the bottle as well as behind it and looking for the value changes. This doesn't get that much darker. It actually gets a little lower contrast in some ways, a little duller. All these within my image over here. Let me scoot this over So I can get back to my menu bar. You'll see that what I've done is I've taken like this drapery, and as it moves behind the bottle, it's grayer. And as I go through and just keep marking in some of these areas, I'm slowly building them. I've used a really small brush on this. I'm on like a size 2 or 3 brush, and part of that is to keep my object small as well. I'll pull up a final image of this value study so you can see about where it ends up. It's not very complex. It doesn't have a lot of refinement in it. And let's pull that up. It's over here in my sidebar. There. Okay. So this is a photograph I took after I was done of the study for this image. You can kind of see how my objects that go back behind here, I've lowered contrast and I've lowered the value on the light parts of the objects. Notice this is very messy right now. That's because this is a really small painting. I mean, here it's maybe like 3 or 4 inches high by like a few inches wide. Well, that's about how big it is in real life. It's not very big. You don't have a lot of room to do stuff, even with a small brush. I'd have to get a really tiny brush out to really refine it. And that part of the reason I stay in the size that I have is so that it's small enough I can get some of these small areas blocked in, but not so small that I start fussing about details. Because the point of this study is that I've noticed like the value change on this part of the fold versus the top part of the fold, or the side here of the object versus the top plane of this drapery. I took this photo just slightly different from my angle because I actually was looking a little bit more down on it than what I'm showing here in this photo, but you kind of get the idea, hopefully. So I do recommend that before you go to working on your canvas, that you start out with doing this exercise as well as the next exercise that I'm going to pull up right now. Let's close down this one, and let's pull up the other video. Which basically, and I grabbed a couple eggs. Here are my eggs right there, okay? No big deal. But I grabbed up some eggs, and I'm using them as just a simple value study so I can kind of get a little bit more used to what I'm doing with the paint. So I'm using this bottom part underneath, and this overall tablet is about 12 by 16 inches, so you can tell this isn't very big, 5 inches maybe tall at the most. And I'm sketching in my eggs just the same way as I sketched in these objects up here. Getting in the eggs down here. Let me move this menu bar out of the way. I'm starting to kind of figure out where my shadow side is on my eggs. And I'm sketching that in really lightly with a little bit of the thinned out black paint. And just to reference where my shadows are within this little demo thing that I'm going to do. The eggs work great for doing something like this. If you have a couple eggs, grab them just a little bit to paint. Mine aren't cooked or anything, so I put them right back in the fridge when I was done. They're nice because they're simple, they're spherical, but they're not like shadows and so on and figure it out. So you can see what I'm doing is I'm blocking in very simply my shadow shapes right now. Made those a little bit darker because when I looked at the comparison, they felt a little bit darker. I'm looking for my halftone areas right now and starting to block in some of my halftone areas. And also referencing this reflected light underneath. Then, and notice that the reflected light is slightly darker even than my halftone areas, which I've hit here in the back edges. Then I'm coming in right here, and the value I blocked in this light side was only a 3 or a 4. I actually stayed pretty dark still for blocking in that light side. You can see how light it actually still appears. And for these shadow areas, I think I used around a 6 or 7 for the reference. Some of my light building and trying to round out that form a little bit. I came back in and did the same thing on the second egg as well. and then started worrying about getting some of my lights and so on out here. So what you'll notice, especially if you had different color drapery from your eggs, like let's say this was blue drapery and it wasn't white drapery, is that it makes a big difference to start blocking in the surrounding drapery, because you go from just noticing the eggs alone in the background to all of a sudden seeing their context within the overall picture plane. And starting to block in these surrounding values gives you a read on whether or not you've hit these initial values correctly. So we'll kind of push through a little bit of this more. So I've finished blocking in some of these values of the surrounding drapery. Now I'm just coming through and starting to refine some of my values a little bit, soften some of my edges where I want to soften them, refining my edges of my drawing. And then finally at the very end, hitting that reflected light just a little bit more so it can be brighter. And the same thing, hitting that reflected light a little bit more refined within that egg. And then I think I wiped out my brush and came in with a blending brush pretty soon. Yeah, hitting a little bit more light in the eggs. And a little bit more light into the drapery. And there's my blending brush. So on this one I use the Egbert because my forms are pretty small. And what you want to do with your blending brush is keep it dry. Do not pre-oil it when you go to use it. And then you wipe it out a lot. So have like a terry cloth towel if you can, because that gets the paint out better. And just barely, very, very light hand pressure, you just kind of skim it on the surface. And you can get rid of some of those brush marks. You can soften some of your edges. Keep wiping it off every few brush strokes so that you soften it the rest of the way. I'm using it to kind of push in and kind of clean up some of this edge. My hands were shaking a lot. So I use it to kind of clean up some of that edge. And then I came back with a small brush and started refining. I strongly recommend doing some practice work like this. This is when I came in with a small detail brush and just hit the little bit of that occlusion shadow, the little pit shadow that I've mentioned underneath the edge of the egg. So I strongly recommend use your canvas paper. That's why I had you guys get it. And do couple practice runs like this. Like, get used to the paint. And make sure you include drapery each time you do it. Don't just paint your object in the middle of a black void. Okay, make sure you include some drapery, because one of the things you need to get used to is how to use the paint to show the volumes of the drapery. I think drapery is so much easier to paint than it is to draw. When you paint, all you do is you start looking at shapes of shadows and light, and you use that to hit the different planes of the drapery. And that's just so much simpler, and it gives you a much more volumetric feeling for the drapery. It's a lot harder, I think, when you start using line work to draw drapery, because then you've got to figure out how to outline a fold that maybe doesn't have an edge. Maybe it's very softly turning, and you've got to figure out how to show that feeling with line work. But when you're actually doing it with paint, you can use hitting the sides of the plane. So the way that I like to describe it is, think of it as if you're carving out something. And so the way you would use a knife to maybe cut out like the side of an apple, or a piece of pumpkin. Let's say you're carving out the side of a piece of watermelon, and you're trying to carve it out and make it rounder. You want to use your paintbrush in that same way. Try and use your paintbrush as you're moving things, and think to yourself, I'm carving out this piece of the drapery. I'm carving out this shadow in the drapery. And think about using your paintbrush as an object that you're carving. Hopefully that helps you guys with getting started.